So I'm really excited to be able to talk about what true access may mean for students with who are multilingual learners with disabilities, like I was myself. And I hope that I provide you with 3 strategies today to kind of think about that you could do back in your positions. So what does building access for all students really mean is really what I hope that I get you to think about beyond the typical processes that happen in K-12 schools today. First, I want to just share the data from the Office of Special Education Programs, the federal data, just to kind of get us started in knowing really what is the percentage of students that we're talking about. So there's about 13% of students as of 2021, which hasn't been updated. So this is the latest data that we have, but it has maintained and creeped up a little bit. So it might be closer to 14%, but more or less it is the same number of students that are served under the special education category or special education law. And about 11 to 12% of them are also English learners with disabilities. So we're really talking about 1% of students who are across the US who are English learners or multilingual learners who are also students with disabilities, or well, I'll continue talking about in terms of dually identified students. 80% of those are educated in the general education classroom with possibly some pull-out or consultation. So it is really important for us to think about what we could do in the general education classroom. And this number equates to about 1 million students that are dually identified across the US. So it is, even though it's 1%, it is a really significant number of students, and they typically have the poorest outcomes. To kind of identify what those poor outcomes mean. Most of them are graduating with less regular high school diplomas, a little bit more dropping out, and more of them receive certificates of attendance, which is not a high school diploma. So the goal here is to really think about what do we need to do to advocate, teach, and support students that are in this category that are being identified. And of course, we know that there is overidentification and underidentification. Some other little bit of data that's come out is English learners are 3.5 more times likely to be placed in special education than regular bilingual learners who have higher levels of English proficiency. So one idea to think about as you move forward in your schools is to think about, what is the English level of the student? And how does that represent into the work that we do? And are we over-identifying the students by a risk ratio of 3.5%? There is under and over-representation of English language and bilingual learners in special education. And again, that happens because of unintended messages that professionals give from the district level or principal level. And those may include something like you have to wait until they're a particular English language level before you refer them to special education. Or on the opposite side, you might hear something like, well, if we send them to special education, they'll get services right away that are in smaller groups and by somebody specialized. Both of these are wrong. So the under and over representation of ELs with disabilities happens because we are over-identifying of those students who may need additional help as they learn English, but under if we're asking them to wait. And so I want to make sure that everybody knows here that the law is very clear. If we have suspect that a student has a disability, we can refer a student for special education evaluation at any point, and that is our ethical responsibility to do. It is not okay to refer them just so that they could get special education teacher that has more time to be with them. In that case, what we really want to do is monitor English language development, and I'll talk a little bit about how you could do that. The other thing that we know is that students that are limited in their native language and in English are more likely to be found eligible for special education, mostly in the area of speech and language disabilities and specific learning disabilities. This is really important because what happens when we used sheltered English immersion programs rather than dual language programs, the language growth doesn't happen as quickly as it could happen as if we have them in a dual language or late transitional bilingual program. So of course, the standard here would be every student who is an English learner goes to a dual language school. We know that's not the case. So really thinking about how we foster native language in our classrooms in any kind of program with ESL support is really important to kind of decrease this. And the last statistic I'll give is the Department of Justice found that the special education evaluation of ELLs was overwhelmingly done in English, even though that may not have been the language of the student, the first language of the students. Again, this is key because oftentimes what I'm finding when I work with school districts is that they didn't even ask if the student was an English learner. There is no ESL teacher representation. And so because we hear the student speak, and there may be a level 3 or a level 4, we test them only in English. Other reasons this happens is that we think that we test in the language of instruction. And although that is important, it is also important to compare and test them and observe them through, naturalistic observation to see how the students do in their native environment, their native language, in order to be able to have a comprehensive picture of what the student is able to do. So those are some ideas that I wanted to kind of think about that I see a lot happening in the field. So let's move into those 3 recommendations that I talked about. What evidence-based vehicles do we have? And those would be collaboration and advocacy, a multi-tier system of support that is culturally and linguistically responsive, and culturally and linguistically sustaining practices as well. So we'll look at 3 of those. I talk a lot about advocacy because I think as somebody who came to this workshop, you are interested in supporting the students, and there needs to be a lot of advocacy from educators in the classroom. That may look like in student support meetings, in the special education evaluation process, and in developing and delivering IEP goals. But advocacy means asking questions, making wanderings during meetings, not accepting what you hear in those meetings, or not bringing in your expertise in ESL or bilingual education or your information about immigrant students to the table. Again, I often find, some practitioners are stronger than others, and some of them just stay quiet and just answer what they're given. What we really need is somebody to take advocacy and ask a lot of questions so that we could get a comprehensive picture of where the student is. The second thing about advocacy is that we need to build shared accountability. And one of the things that special education law is very clear about is that there needs to be growth towards grade level access and standards. So even if a child is 3 or 4 or 5 years behind, there needs to be shared accountability that the student is growing each year towards getting closer to that grade level attainment through different tiers of support. And that can only happen if multiple educators are doing evaluation in multiple contexts, meaning we want to see them in the gen ed class, in the ESL class, in the SPED class, because as we're learning language, we display different behaviors in different contexts. The next part is really thinking about the specialties that you have in your room, in your schools, that we don't take advantage of. Again, this is something that I also see a lot. So I wanted to kind of put all the expertise of the general educator, the ML educator, and the special educator. And as you can see, each educator brings a different level of expertise that is quite unique for their area. So of course, the general educator is really versed on the standards, the curriculum, and looking at how do you manage 20 to 25, 30 students and applying the universal design for learning principles. The ML educator is very specific on recognizing the stages of language, using native language, and looking to see what traumatic experiences can impact learning, while also monitoring their language development of the students. And of course, a special education teacher is really expert in how do they meet the IEP goals, explaining the present level of performance, doing a specialized design instruction, and explaining how instruction can happen in different delivery areas, such as the general education classroom, the ESL, or in special education. So think about as 3 superheroes that could share with each other how to do best practices from their own discipline. This is important because, again, I don't see it. I feel like teachers think that you all know the same things, and really you don't. And so really teaching your peer what you know about the students, curriculum, language, and special education needs is really critical for that shared accountability and for delivery of instruction. Let's move to multi-tier system of support. You're probably all familiar with this 3-level system of support. And really, this one is the general education, but I'm going to move to looking at that triangle from the perspective of English learners or multilingual learners. And so what I want to make special mention here is that the universal core instruction, or your tier 1, has to be delivered to all our multilinguals. That's the richness of the curriculum, the vocabulary, the practice with it. And sometimes we take them out to give them ESL in exchange for that. When we take them out, we're taking them from the richness of the curriculum. So it's really important that part of your advocacy includes ensuring that you're given, or you could create a schedule that takes them out after the general curriculum material, academics of literacy and math are delivered, to then do additional reteaching or previewing of material. That is really key. The other aspects that I want you to think about is that for tier 2 and tier 3, that ESL is not considered a tier 2. So if you have a win block or what you need block or an intervention block, that you don't use that intervention block just to do ESL. That is an intervention block. That is where a strategic, bilingual, research-based intervention should be delivered in addition to tier 1 and in addition to ESL support. Ideally, that and the tier 3 level is designed with an ESL teacher in mind so that they know what is the area that is best for these particular students. And I have some information coming up. But just quickly, like, the intervention should always focus on vocabulary development and should have highly engaged oral language practice, which we'll talk about in a minute. On the other side of the triangle, we have the screening and monitoring. And I think school districts are doing a really good job of doing it 3 times a year. And so for multilinguals, we want to be able to monitor that for their native language and English. Again, the idea is we're collecting longitudinal data as time goes by, so that if they are referred for special education, we know how they're developing in both languages, because most often when you see a disability, you see it appear in both languages. But if we only have data in English, we don't know whether it is a language difference or a language disability or a learning disability. Progress monitoring is something that schools are getting better at. And again, one of the areas that they're not getting better at is doing observation-based indicators of assessment. So use your WIDA can-do indicators to monitor what you're seeing the behaviors of your students are. We have such a short time today, so I can't do that. But I definitely want you to think about using those WIDA indicators. Talk to your ESL teacher if you're not, and put those across every 5 to 6 weeks, where you could just observe the student and track what behaviors of language you're seeing them develop. That is a way to monitor progress and know whether students are able to learn and the rate of that learning, and if that compares to peers that come from similar backgrounds, and that kind of comparison. And of course, diagnostic data is really key to know which intervention in which area the student needs. And so thinking about that with the ESL teacher is key. And as you look at this whole triangle, we have to remember, again, before I move on, I want to make sure ESL should be part of every conversation on assessment and intervention. And it should be focused, every intervention and instruction should focus oracy, which I'll tell you what it is in just about a minute. And oracy across all tiers. That is what children need. Our multilingual learners need practice with the oral language around academic subjects. So let's look at that in a second. Meanwhile, I wanted to kind of review a couple of things again, what MTSS for ELs musts are. One is, again, ensure the ESL is part of tier 1, ensure that the ESL teacher is part of developing, consulting, or delivering your tier 2 and tier 3. Ensuring the ESL teachers have common planning time. So for my administrators and district leaders, please ensure that that happens. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. And so they're creating different curriculum that is not coordinated, and they get more of a burden of now trying to learn 2 or 3 curriculums. Ensure that the IEP goals are defined, that the goals define what is the ELD level and skills they need to be able to access that goal. That is something that I'm yet to see in IEPs done pretty well. And so really defining the ELD goal as part of the IEP goal, the academic goal, is really key to ensuring that we can meet those goals towards grade level growth. Remember that. Okay, so what is MTSS and what is not? It's a way, again, to guarantee access to the general curriculum that includes ESL at every tier. Is the opportunity for data-driven problem solving across professionals. So include the ESL and SPED teachers. MTSS should not just be general ed teachers needing to look at data. It is a preventive approach rather than a wait to fail model, because you are collecting data all throughout the year. It looks at students' strengths and the socio-emotional history, so it's creating some language and cultural responsiveness, and it addresses both over-identification if we are disaggregating data from your benchmark data by groups. So I love if you would be able to look at your benchmark data, whether it's DIBELS or whatever you collect, and look at ELD level 1s, ELD level 2s, ELD level 3s, 4s, and 5s, and dually identify students and look at their trajectories of growth so that you could do something different for those groups. Let's move on to our third area, which is culturally and linguistically sustaining practices. And so here is a little bit of what we know. There is low fidelity of core in tier 1, which makes it difficult to determine the cause of a learning difficulty or a learning language difference. And so progress monitoring is key, okay? The other thing that we know is that ELs benefit when instruction and intervention includes that oracy component that matches the language of instruction and intervention, but when it is also that the native language is valued to translanguaging in the classroom. And let's look at what oracy is specifically. Oracy is a must in all instructional strategies and is a subset of skills and strategies where the language within the language that are more closely related to literacy objectives. So it really is the ability for students to use their interpersonal social language in an academic context with academic supports like sentence starters, vocabulary. So it's lessons where the students are mediating the language with each other, using translanguaging as needed to understand and be able to share what they're learning. Ideally, it involves culturally relevant, explicit, universally signed instruction so that the students make connections to their funds of knowledge and that there has different entry points to be able to talk about that academic language. And it also provides opportunities to learn, apply, and practice this language, often with peers in authentic activities. And that's the key. The only way to learn a new language is to practice it. We all know that, but we're really talking too much in our classrooms, and we really need to structure opportunities to do that better. And I'll give you some ideas here. So according to the What Works Clearinghouse, there's an enormous amount of research that tells us how our oracy could be helpful through different approaches. The one that I like the most is called peer-assisted learning strategies. There's a link there for you. And class-wide peer tutoring. Again, those are all peer-mediated learning where the student is able to use their social language to learn academic language. There's also the focus on vocabulary, and there is another link there to get you to a specific strategy on how to teach vocabulary in 25 minutes. Vocabulary is least area seen in instruction in literacy and this lower elementary grade levels. And finally, small group instruction with ESL supports. And again, there's a link there to another report that will tell you some of the strategies specifically related to that. But oracy and peer-mediated learning, vocabulary, and small group instruction are really key elements that should be in every tier of instruction. I also knew that we would get some questions about responsive assessment. And so I wanted to just kind of show this table, and I have about like 1 minute. So this is what typically happens in your MTSS model that then comes into the special education evaluation. So you'll see Sam here, who's going through these process of a universal screening, a diagnostic, an intervention, and progress monitoring. And if he doesn't make progress, then he would probably be referred after a second intervention to the special education team for evaluation. Now, for our little girl here, who's an English learner, this looks a little bit different. So You would have a diagnostic assessment but in English and the native language, and also include informal and classroom observations across different contexts, like I shared earlier. We'd have a parent interview and a true peer comparison, meaning that you compare to students that have as many comparison experiences as the student, and I'll share a little bit of those, so that we know whether it's a language trajectory or a disability. And then using a data-driven, evidence-based intervention that I discussed before, not just the Wilson reading or whatever is the default intervention that a school may have. So I hope you could take that. The true peer comparison, which is our last kind of thing that I talk about, is the ability to think about comparing a minimum of 3 to 5 students on qualities as many as you could match. So if, Sam is having trouble, we want to match Sam by native language proficiency, English proficiency level, time in the current school or academic program, experiences coming to this country, birth in the US, familial composition, and the community microcosm. So if you grew up in Miami versus growing up in Boston, the microcosm would be very different in terms of, how much exposure to language 1 and language 2 the student's getting. So this is just like a quick and dirty kind of things to think about. I provided some of the research connecting this, and I hope that this is helpful as you continue to think about how to support your students. I hope you also can think about one practice that you could take back so that you could grow as a teacher based on the content that you hear today. And then I've included certain links to important information that's been provided by our federal government that would be helpful in this area. Thank you so much.